Slowdown, more commonly referred to as lag, is a concept encountered primarily in speedruns for titles released on older gaming consoles, like the NES or the SNES. Have you ever played one of these games and then suddenly there's 3000 enemies on the screen and the game gets so much slower? Yeah, that's lag. This happens when there's too much going on for the console to handle. Every single frame of runtime, which is generally 1/60th of a second, the console is tasked to process everything that's going on in order to generate the next frame of action. If it cannot do that, then its way of coping with that is to delay everything by one more frame to create more time for all that processing to occur. In some areas of a game, there may be a constant need for this extra frame of time, which leads to very noticeable slowdown in the gameplay. As you can guess, this will lose time, and if you're running a game that is affected by this phenomenon and you're really trying to save all the time you can, then you will want to work on minimizing the amount of lag frames you encounter. The way you can achieve this can vary from game to game, but some common ways include stuff like killing enemies, avoid throwing unnecessary projectiles, or moving the camera somewhere that's easier to render. The goal in the end is to reduce the amount of math that the console has to do, and it's not always obvious what may achieve that goal, and you may even encounter some pretty creative ways to do so. For example, in some games you can do things that will mute the background music, as is the case in Mega Man 3's Dark Shadow stage. Well, not having to process the music is less stuff for the console to handle, so sometimes that can make the difference between a lag frame and a non-lag frame. Sometimes it might be worth it to go quite far out of your way to reduce lag in some extreme cases, but don't neglect the more isolated lag frames. They can be tricky to spot, but if you can eliminate these ones too, the time save can build up to a decent amount over the course of an entire run. It's easiest to spot lag frames on an emulator like BitHawk, which will usually point them out to you whenever they happen, but some practice mods have features that can help you spot them too. Whenever you find some lag, just try something else and see if you can reduce it or eliminate it. Now, in some rare circumstances, lag frames can actually be useful. Why? Well, during a lag frame, consoles usually don't bother polling for inputs on the controller, meaning that if you were to press a button exactly on that frame, the state of the controller won't be right until the next frame. As a consequence, in situations where you have to time an input within a specific frame, if that frame happens to be preceded by a lag frame, then essentially this will extend the frame window of this input by one frame, since you can make that input both on the regular frame as well as on the lag frame right before it. Just make sure you're still holding that input after the lag frame is over. Another scenario in which lag frames can sometimes help is in situations in which they might affect a game's code or physics calculations. They can sometimes allow things like clipping through walls in some games, so stay on the lookout for that kind of stuff as well. And finally, just note that this mechanic does not usually impact modern titles, where frame skipping is a more common technique to deal with situations that are taxing on hardware. This usually means that games occasionally skip the graphic rendering section of a frame to create more time, while prioritizing that the gameplay runs at a steady frame rate, which means that ultimately you get no slowdown. Lag optimizations are something I find pretty cool though. They can be pretty invisible at times, but they can also make for some fun puzzles during the routing process. So if you ever end up having to deal with them, I hope you do enjoy them.